I noticed the strange marks on the ground that autumn morning. 58 years out in the fields had taught me when something wasn't right. Deep tire tracks cut right through my organic cornfield, forming an impromptu circuit around my cultivated areas. The following Saturday, I woke up to the roar of powerful engines. 5 luxury SUVs, led by a shiny white Range Rover, were speeding across my property, kicking up dust and wrecking even more of my crops. I immediately recognized the driver of that Range Rover, Patricia Miller, president of the Homeowners Association in that condo complex built less than a kilometer away. She and her friends were laughing as they took sharp turns on my land, treating decades of hard work as if it were their own personal racetrack. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get more stories like this. Instead of confronting them right away, I came up with a plan. For days, I worked discreetly in the areas where the vehicles had passed. I dug some strategic irrigation channels, redirected water from a nearby spring, and added clay to the soil. As expected, they returned the following Sunday. The cloudy sky set the perfect scene. I watched from my porch as the vehicles lined up on my property. First came laughter, then engines revving up, and then, just as planned, the unmistakable sound of tires spinning and people screaming. The mud trap I set worked like a charm. 5 luxury SUVs, including Patricia's spotless Range Rover, got stuck up to the axles in thick, sticky mud. The drivers got out of their vehicles, their designer clothes and expensive shoes soaked as they struggled uselessly to free their cars. Patricia was the first to see me on the porch. Her normally composed face turned to pure fury as she hobbled toward me, slipping with every step. "What have you done to my property?" she shouted, pointing at the mud pit. I stayed calm, leaning on my oak cane. "This is my property, Mrs. Miller. The same one you and your friends have been using as a racetrack without permission." "This is outrageous! You set a trap on purpose!" "I just improved the irrigation on my land. If you hadn't been trespassing, your vehicles would be safe at home." The other drivers came over, all angry and covered in mud. A drenched man in a suit even threatened to sue me. "You're on private property," I replied calmly. "I could call the sheriff if you need clarification on where your condo starts and my family's farm ends. Been in our family since 1952. The following week, I got an official letter from the Homeowners Association, citing supposed code violations. I couldn't help but laugh as I read every paragraph, because my property was never under the HOA's jurisdiction. Patricia was trying to intimidate me with bogus official documents. A few days later, a man showed up claiming to be a county inspector. He wanted to check my facilities, mentioning anonymous complaints about irregularities. When I asked for his official ID and proper permits, he visibly hesitated. A quick call to the county administration confirmed my suspicions. No inspection was actually scheduled. Tensions rose when Patricia showed up with 3 HOA members at the entrance of my property. She was holding a megaphone and making absurd demands about my fence, spoiling the neighborhood aesthetics, and my farming equipment, lowering local property values. "Mrs. Miller," I said when she finally paused to catch her breath, "maybe you don't realize, but my farm existed long before your condo. We're half a kilometer outside your association's jurisdiction. My family has owned this land since 1952, long before you moved here 5 years ago." Things reached a boiling point on a sunny Tuesday when I got back from the store and found a yellow excavator parked near my gate. Patricia was there with 2 men, studying an open map on the hood of her new car. "What's going on here?" I asked firmly. "We're fixing the drainage problem you created," Patricia replied without looking at me. "It's a danger to local traffic. This is private property. You're not allowed to bring heavy equipment onto my land." Patricia smirked arrogantly. "I have a city order." I grabbed my phone and called the number I'd already saved. "Officer Bryce?" "Yes. The situation I mentioned last week is happening now." "Yes." She brought in an excavator. While Officer Bryce was talking with Patricia and the excavator operators, I sat on the bench on my porch. The gray-haired sheriff, 62 years old with decades of experience, didn't take long to resolve the situation. The supposed city order turned out to be nothing more than a work request form filled out by Patricia herself, with no official signature or stamp. "Mrs. Miller, I'm confiscating this document as evidence of forgery," Officer Bryce announced, carefully folding the paper and putting it in the inside pocket of his uniform. "Mr. Johnson, do you wish to file a formal complaint?" I shook my head. "I just want you all to respect my property boundaries, Bryce." Patricia watched the excavator drive off with an expression of pure hatred directed at me. The neighbors, who had gathered to watch the spectacle, went back to their homes, many with barely concealed smirks. This wasn't the first time Patricia had abused her authority. it was just the first time someone had managed to stop her. A week later, I received official correspondence from the county court. Patricia had filed a lawsuit against me, alleging deliberate trap resulting in significant material damage to vehicles, emotional distress from public humiliation, and potential depreciation of adjacent properties. The amount she was asking for was absurd, $200,000 plus court costs, an amount Patricia knew was impossible for a small farmer like me. The strategy was clear: force me to sell my land to cover her legal expenses. I picked up the phone and called Martin Schneider, a retired lawyer I had helped years ago when his truck broke down during a snowstorm. Martin had retired from practicing law, but still kept his license active, and occasionally took cases he thought were morally important. "Johnson, long time no see." Martin's deep voice sounded reassuring. "How's life out in the fields?" "Complicated, Martin. I'm dealing with a HOA president trying to kick me off my own land." An hour later, Martin was sitting at my kitchen table, going over the lawsuit documents while sipping coffee. His reading glasses slid down his nose as he flipped through the pages. "This is ridiculous," he finally declared, removing his glasses. "First, she and her friends were trespassing on your property. Second, you didn't set a trap. You merely altered your land to improve drainage, which you have every right to do. Third, she has no legal basis to claim a depreciation of adjacent properties, since yours has been here long before her condo." For the next 2 months, legal battles took up a significant part of my time. Martin worked tirelessly and almost without charge, accepting only some produce from my garden as payment. He'd won similar cases against predatory real estate developers and knew exactly how to proceed. During the preliminary hearing, Patricia showed up impeccably dressed in a white suit, flanked by 2 lawyers from a prestigious firm in the city. She wore expensive jewelry and a golden HOA badge on her chest. Her disdainful look when she saw Martin in his old suit and worn leather briefcase was almost comical. Judge Mason, a sensible man in his 60s who knew the local history inside out, patiently listened to both sides. Patricia's lawyers presented photos of intentional damage to the vehicles, conveniently ignoring that they had been illegally on private property. When it was our turn, Martin simply presented 2 pieces of evidence: the original deed from 1952, and a video recorded by one of my neighbors showing the group of SUVs invading and destroying my crops weeks before the incident. "Your Honor," Martin concluded calmly, "Mr. Johnson not only had every right to modify his property, but he could also have called the police and had all the trespassers arrested for invasion and destruction of private property. Instead, he chose the least confrontational solution possible." Judge Mason removed his glasses, rubbed his tired eyes, and sighed deeply. "Mrs. Miller, I'm dismissing all your claims and strongly advising you not to pursue this lawsuit. Should you insist, consider that Mr. Johnson could easily countersue for trespassing, damage to his agricultural property, continued harassment, and attempted forgery of official documents. Are you sure you want to continue?" Patricia's face turned red with anger, but her lawyers whispered something urgently in her ear. After a tense moment, she agreed to drop the lawsuit. As we left the courtroom, Martin smiled at me. "Johnson, you've already won the legal battle, but I know that sort of person. Patricia isn't going to stop here." Unfortunately, Martin was right. 2 weeks after the hearing, I noticed unusual activity on the vacant lot to the north of my property. A swampy piece of land of about 4 hectares that belonged to an out-of-towner investor, who had never done anything with it because of the frequent autumn floods. Survey trucks and men with topographic equipment were measuring and marking the area. Colorful flags started appearing, followed by numbered stakes and reflective tape marking what looked like a construction project. I walked over to the boundary for a closer look and came face to face with a huge, freshly installed sign. "Future location of Riverside Estates, an exclusive extension of the Oak Ridge HOA community. Premium plots available." In the lower corner of the sign, in smaller but unmistakable letters, "Development, Miller Enterprises." I couldn't believe it. Patricia had bought that swampy adjacent lot and planned to expand the HOA's domain right up to the edge of my property. Clearly, a maneuver to completely surround me and ramp up the pressure. In the next few days, the project moved at an impressive speed. Heavy machinery began grading the land. Trucks dumped tons of gravel and sand to try to raise the swampy area, and a team of workers installed an elaborate drainage system directed toward a creek running along my property's eastern edge. One Sunday, while checking on my pumpkin patch, I saw Patricia giving instructions to a group of workers who were putting up a tall fence along the border of our properties. She smiled when she saw me and walked right up to the edge. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson. she said in a fake friendly tone. Like the neighborhood improvements? Mrs. Miller, that land floods every autumn. It always has. She laughed. Not anymore. We're installing a state-of-the-art drainage system. This is going to be the most exclusive development in the whole county. Your drainage system isn't going to work with that creek. You're interfering with a natural water flow that's been in place for centuries. Patricia adjusted her expensive sunglasses. Our engineers disagree. Either way, I'm kindly letting you know that your old fence will need to be replaced to meet the new aesthetic standards for this expanded community. My property isn't part of your HOA, Patricia. Her smile widened, almost predatory. Not yet, Mr. Johnson. But when you're completely surrounded by our community, economic and social pressures will do their job. Your rustic lifestyle won't cut it here. She turned to leave, then added, I've already told the association members that eventually we'll turn that historic relic you call a farm into a country club and equestrian center. It's only a matter of time until that old stubborn relic accepts reality and sells out to us. For the next 2 months, I watched the swampy lot transform into a frenzied construction site. Premium lots for sale signs popped up like mushrooms after the rain. A show home began to take shape, an ostentatious mansion with Greco-Roman columns and an elaborate fountain set in the middle of a roundabout for cars. It was clear Patricia had invested a fortune in the project. According to my neighbor Ted, who worked at the local bank, she had mortgaged her own home and used her savings as collateral for a substantial loan to finance the venture. Construction continued at breakneck speed even when the first autumn rain started. Workers battled worsening mud, constantly pumping water as they tried to finish laying the foundations for the first planned homes. By mid-October, a small ceremony was held on the lot. From my porch, using binoculars, I watched Patricia cut a red ribbon at the entrance of the show home, surrounded by potential buyers in fancy clothes, all holding champagne glasses. Balloons and banners declared, "Welcome to the future of Oak Ridge." That night, checking the weather forecast as I've done daily for decades, I noticed an alert. A significant storm front was approaching, with heavy rains predicted for the next 3 days. As an experienced farmer, I knew exactly what that meant for a swampy lot that had been artificially modified. I didn't have to do a thing but wait. The storm hit in full force on Wednesday night. I woke up to the violent sound of rain pelting my roof and distant thunder rolling. Outside my window, occasional lightning illuminated a landscape transformed into a muddy sea. Around 6 in the morning, still in the midst of the storm, my phone rang. It was Ted, my neighbor, his voice urgent. "Johnson, have you seen the Miller lot? It's a total mess." I grabbed my raincoat and rubber boots and headed north to the border. What I saw confirmed all my predictions. The Riverside Estates lot had literally turned into a river. The elaborate drainage system, unable to handle the volume of water, had collapsed in a catastrophic failure. The show home, which Patricia had been so proud of, was partially underwater, its grand entrance now acting as a channel for the violently rushing water. The premium lots signs floated like tiny boats adrift. The newly laid foundations of the other houses had turned into makeshift pools, some already crumbling under the pressure of water and mud. While I was watching, a white pickup truck with the County Public Works Department emblem pulled up along the main road. A middle-aged man stepped out, protected by a raincoat, and began methodically photographing the extent of the disaster. I recognized him immediately. Howard Garrison, the county's chief inspector, known for his unwavering integrity and encyclopedic knowledge of local building codes. "Good morning, Howard," I called out as I walked over. "Johnson," he nodded, not taking his eyes off the camera. "What a mess, huh?" "Predictable," I replied simply. Howard sighed, lowering his camera. "Yeah, predictable. That lot has been zoned as a floodplain since 1978. It should never have been approved for residential development. How did they even get approval?" Howard removed his fogged-up glasses and wiped them on a dry corner of his jacket. "They didn't. I'm here to document that violation. Their permit application was under review with a preliminary negative opinion, but someone decided to start construction anyway." I wasn't surprised. Patricia's impatience was legendary, just like her belief that rules were just suggestions for people like her. An hour later, as the rain let up for a moment, a procession of luxury vehicles arrived. Patricia stepped out of the lead car, her face a mask of horror as she took in the wreckage of her investment. She was dressed in an elegant outfit completely unsuitable for the situation, her high heels sinking immediately into the mud. Beside her, a man in a suit, whom I recognized as her lead attorney, looked equally horrified, though likely more concerned about the legal implications than the physical destruction. Patricia froze when she saw Inspector Howard pinning an official notice to an improvised post at the entrance of the development. She awkwardly ran toward him, slipping several times. "What do you think you're doing?" she shouted, her shrill voice cutting through the damp air. Howard, unruffled after decades of dealing with angry property owners, simply handed her a copy of the document. "Mrs. Miller, I'm issuing an immediate stop work order on all activity on this lot. This development violates the County Wetlands Protection Act of 1978 and at least 17 different building codes." "This is absurd. I have all the necessary permits," Patricia protested, her perfectly applied makeup running in the fine rain. "No, ma'am," Howard replied calmly, consulting his clipboard protected by a plastic cover. "Your permit request was still under review, with a negative technical opinion. No final permit for residential development has been issued for this lot." Patricia's lawyer grabbed her arm, whispering something urgently in her ear. She broke free. "But we've already invested over $1 million here. The show home is nearly complete." "The show home that's now serving as an impromptu drainage channel," I observed quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Patricia spun to look at me, her eyes flashing pure hatred. You knew about this all along. Why didn't you warn us?" I kept my expression neutral. "I warned you, Mrs. Miller. I clearly said that this lot always flooded in the autumn. As the owner of the neighboring farm since 1952, my family has documented the flooding patterns of this area for 3 generations." Howard nodded, jotting something down on his clipboard. "That's going to be very useful for our final report, Mr. Johnson. The Department of Environmental Management will appreciate your historical documentation." In the days that followed, it became clear that the Riverside Estates project was completely ruined as the waters slowly receded. The show home had suffered irreparable structural damage, its foundations compromised by erosion. The other structures barely started were entirely wrecked, with tons of construction materials reduced to muddy rubble. A week after the storm, a special hearing was called by the County Planning Commission. The municipal auditorium was packed, curious locals, bewildered and worried HOA members, local newspaper reporters, and of course, Patricia with her visibly diminished legal team. The commission's chair, a retired geologist in his 70s, got straight to the point. "The decision is unanimous. The Riverside Estates project is permanently canceled. This lot will be reclassified as a wetland preservation area, with no possibility for future residential or commercial development." The financial blow for Patricia was devastating. The local bank filed a foreclosure on her personal home to cover the defaulted loan. The contracted construction company filed a breach of contract lawsuit. The few buyers who had made down payments demanded their money back with interest. In an emergency HOA meeting, streamed live on Facebook by one of the younger residents, Patricia faced the wrath of the association members. They had been convinced to financially back the project with promises of rising property values and exclusive access to the new facilities. "You assured us that all permits were in order," shouted one of the older residents. "Our HOA reserve fund was used as collateral. How could we have authorized this?" another one demanded. At the end of the tumultuous meeting, Patricia was forced to resign from the HOA presidency she'd held with an iron fist for nearly a decade. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get more stories like this. On a quiet November afternoon, almost a month after that fateful storm, I was on the porch peeling freshly picked apples, when I noticed an unfamiliar car slowly approaching along the dirt road. Not the white Range Rover, but a rented compact sedan, as indicated by the sticker on its bumper. The vehicle stopped in front of my house, and Patricia got out on the driver's side. She was almost unrecognizable. No elaborate makeup, wearing simple jeans and a loose sweater, her hair carelessly tied back in a ponytail. It was as if she'd aged a decade in just a few weeks. She lingered by the car for a few moments, clearly gathering her courage, before hesitantly walking up the porch steps. I kept peeling my apples, waiting for her to speak first. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice missing its usual arrogance. "May I speak with you for a minute?" I pointed to the empty rocking chair next to me. She climbed the steps and sat down, looking at her restless hands in her lap. "I came to apologize," she finally said, the words coming out with obvious difficulty. "And also to let you know that I'm moving. I sold my house, or what's left of my assets after the court settlements." I nodded, slicing an apple into thin, spiral pieces that landed in the bowl on my lap. "You knew from the start, didn't you?" she asked softly. "About the land being unsuitable for building." "Every local farmer does," I replied simply. "That area has always naturally controlled flooding. Nature has its own engineering, developed over thousands of years. Patricia sighed deeply. I thought I could bend nature with money and determination. What foolish arrogance. We sat in silence for a few minutes, accompanied only by the sound of the knife-cutting apples and the soft creak of the rocking chair filling the air. My lawyers wanted to make me try to pin some responsibility on you, she continued, saying you had crucial information and didn't share it properly. But that would have just been another lie to myself. And what did you decide? Enough lies. I'm starting over in another state. My sister has a small apartment above her flower shop in Vermont. I'm going to help her with the business. I offered her a slice of apple. She accepted, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. You know what's ironic, Mr. Johnson? I grew up on a farm in the Midwest. My dad was a farmer. I spent my whole adult life running away from those roots, building this fancy urban persona. And now, in the end, I realize I never really understood what my father tried to teach me about respecting the land. It's never too late to learn, Mrs. Miller. Patricia stood up, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder. The new owners of my house seem like decent people. A young family with 2 small kids. I made sure they knew to respect you and your property. Thank you. She extended her hand formally. I shook it, noticing the recent calluses on her palm, probably from days of packing up belongings and carrying boxes. Goodbye, Mr. Johnson, and thank you. For what? I asked, genuinely curious. For not saying I told you so. For not gloating when you had every right to. As she reached her car, I called out, Patricia? She turned. Good luck in Vermont. She nodded one last time and got into the vehicle. I watched the car slow down in the distance until it turned the corner and disappeared. I went back to my apples and the comforting silence of my porch. Overhead, a hawk circled in the blue autumn sky, patient and watchful. Around me, the farm my family had tended for 3 generations continued on its own steady, peaceful rhythm. Next spring, I'd plant new fruit trees along the northern border. In a few years, they'd provide enough shade for a bench where I could sit on warm summer afternoons. Maybe I'd even invite the new neighbors and their kids to pick apples when the season arrived. The land endures. People come and go. The seasons change. And life, as always, finds its natural balance. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get more stories like this.